Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the last afternoon of day 3 of the EduSummit. I hope many of you have joined some of the other sessions because we've had a really fantastic conference, but we have been saving the best to last. And this isn't quite last, but it's the running towards the end. So in this session, we're going to be hearing from Emma Brown, who is an account director at RM, and especially from James Browning, who is the Chief Digital Information Officer at Academies Enterprise Trust. Emma and James are here this afternoon to discuss with you about how AET moved to a very successful remote learning program during lockdown, including the preparations they made ahead of time. But also the lessons they've learned along the way, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit about what they're doing now and how they're planning for a more blended future. But we'll find out about that. Before I hand over, I would just like to remind everybody on the call that this is a discussion session, so we're really interested in the questions from the audience. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find in the bottom right of your screen, and we'll come to those at the end of the session in about 45 minutes or so. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emma.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, James.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Simon. It's lovely to be with you and the audience this afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Great. We're really delighted. James and I have worked together for a little while, and we think we've got some really interesting things that we can talk to this afternoon, particularly in terms of AET's journey during what has been a really challenging time, but something that's seen some really positive outcomes, I think, particularly at AET in terms of what online learning has looked like. James, before I start quizzing you, what I'd like to do is just to take our minds back actually to ahead of lockdown, because AET had already begun their journey to transitioning to working in the cloud. And I think there were some things that were in place that enabled you to make probably be a little bit quicker off the blocks than some people when lockdown hit and you wanted to start to transition to to online learning. Do you mind telling us a little bit about some of those building blocks that you put in place and some of the things that you think helped you make a good start?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it makes sense to start for anybody that isn't aware with a bit of context of who AET are. So as Simon mentioned, we're a multi-academy trust. We are made up of 58 academies. Within those academies, across those academies, there's around 30,000 students, around 5,000 staff. So certainly one of the bigger multi-academy trusts. But let me not beat about the bush. AET has been on quite a journey, and it hasn't all been ups. If you go back, and don't worry, I won't go too far back in history, but if you go back to 2017, it was a trust that was on the brink of closure. It was under written notice from DFE. It was under regular supervision, special measures, if you like, and it's from that point that the journey really starts. As I say, I won't go through every bit of the twist and turn of the journey, but it's fair to say that from that point, there's been a huge turnaround. And for anybody who's interested, there's a fantastic written and verbal document, which is called the Blueprint for Turnaround for Multi-Academy Trusts, which documents the journey AET had been on between 2017 and 2019, in which it got to a really positive place and continues to be on that upward trajectory from this point forward. The reason I share that is that prior to lockdown, AET had got to the point where it had a really clear strategy, a really clear vision, not just for technology, but as a trust overall, a really clear set of values. And there was a direction of travel which gave these foundations that Emma mentioned. And I'll mention a few of them now. So first of all, from a technology perspective, some of the building blocks were starting to get in place. So there was a clear device strategy. We're moving towards putting devices into students and staff's hands. We made a clear choice on our underlying platform. We're users of Google, the biggest education users of Google in Europe, actually. So in good position where that's concerned. And certainly some of the operational processes that we used were starting to get there. Certainly as a central team, as an executive team, we were in a fairly good place. We were really early on though, in certainly in hindsight, looking back now and how far we've come. To give you some context, across our 58 schools, there are about 1,000 Google Classroom environments set up. When I come on to talk about where we are now, you'll get some context as to how immature really we were, but the building blocks were there. From a people perspective, some of those building blocks were starting to get there as well. We'd had this concept of creating a network of champions across the trust. We later called them Innovators, and they were what turned out to be really, really key in getting us moving in that direction, and really mobilizing when the pandemic hit us in the same way it hit everybody else. And we'd started to build out a view of a CPD offering for the benefit of the academies as well. Where we were less mature is on the curriculum itself and being in a position of, if you like, stitching together those technology foundations and how we teach and learn. Lots of fantastic curriculum materials, but mostly written. We haven't really started to digitize that in much of a way. And so what I'm really getting at is that we had some of the foundations in quite a good place. We've of course got the partnership of RM, which gives us that confidence of support. But really, kind of on a journey which, had it not been for the pandemic, would have been quite long term in its nature.
And James, that's a really helpful scene setting. And in terms of those initial steps when the pandemic hit, and there was that drive to take, where possible, some learning online, I'm very aware that looked very different from the first to the second lockdown, but just separating those out, can you think about some of the things that you did initially that really enabled your students to get going with online learning, and some of the things that you think really helped with that? Yeah,
I mean, it certainly started to pull on some of those key strategic values that I briefly mentioned. One of those is to be unusually brave. And, it may sound a bit trite, but really we are incredibly proud at how quickly and how bravely we mobilized a plan when the first wave of the pandemic and first lockdown hit. Probably the best example of that is what we did with our device strategy. So I mentioned that we had this device strategy laid out, and we were working towards putting devices into people's hands. But within, I think, 4 days of the first lockdown, we had trustee approval. And anybody that works in multi-academy trusts will know that, the approach to approvals and governance can sometimes take time and paperwork and things like that. But within days, we'd commissioned millions of pounds worth of spend on devices. And I think the last count within the year, we did purchased 18,500 devices. Gives you a sense of investment and scale to make that decision in such a short space of time. Whilst others were trying to grapple with how to respond, really put us in good stead. It allowed us to get those devices out to academies, put them into hands of students, and it really just chimes in with our philosophy of making sure that nobody's left behind. Lots of students have access to devices at home. To add a little bit more context onto the nature of AET, we have a huge, diverse network of schools with ranging from affluence to deprivation and different levels of access to technology. It was so critical for us to get to a place where we were putting everybody on an even playing field really early. Very quickly after that, a plan formed that sat around that. Access to connectivity, a similar level of investment in Wi-Fi devices to support, active lobbying of the government to play a role in supporting that direction of travel as well. We made decisions before the government came with their support, but that was welcome, of course, when it did. Clearly, the technology is just the building blocks. What then followed was, okay, how do we now bring this to life? How do we start to make this a routine part of the way we teach and learn? Clearly, we didn't know what was to follow in terms of the length of the lockdown and the length of the disruption, if you like. But nevertheless, we started to build out pretty thorough plans with regards to what we refer to as virtual learning. Some of that included basics like the way we manage attendance, and how we manage that within our MIS. But it quickly moves forward into the practicals of what's that teaching and learning model look like. We're quite a structured way of academic performance and processes within AET, and applying that in the way that we needed to virtual learning was not without challenge. Very quickly we arrived at some ways in which we could get some benefit to the whole of AET. Probably the best example that springs to mind is we struck up the idea of masterclasses, which are, if you like, kind of equivalent to TED Talks for the benefit of all of AET. Most popular of which is a teacher called Madame Bell. She still to this day delivers French and other language lessons on a weekly basis for the benefit of all of our schools. And that doesn't take away the role of the local teacher, but it allows the teaching in a local sense to follow on and make sure that's a tailored experience, whether that be physical or indeed in those times virtual. And I'm starting to touch upon some things we'll probably explore in a little while, which is some of the great things we'll take out of the pandemic. But hopefully that just gives you the essence of your question answered, Emma.
Yeah, it does, James. And it's interesting that you start to touch on the masterclasses and the concept of one-to-many, and then how you also then supplement that by enabling teachers in schools to be able to support potentially smaller groups. Engagement was certainly something that a lot of schools struggled with during this period. It's been reported quite widely that while students may have been online, how engaged were they in activities? And it sounds like by exploring some of these different ways of delivering the curriculum and using these different tools, that was something that you were exploring.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've talked quite a lot so far, haven't I, about teaching and learning. And of course, that's a massive part of our response during lockdown. But you touched upon something there, which is equally, if not more important to us, which is, of course, well-being. And clearly linking that into attendance is important, but attendance can be kind of binary. Are you there or are you not? We introduced something that, once again, we maintain to this day and plan to carry on doing, the concept of every child check-ins, ECCI. And every child check-ins were a real statement and a measure of intent for us to make sure that we are engaging on a child-by-child basis to see where are they at, how do they feel, what are they missing, how can we help them. And those check-ins that we did evolved over time, started out very simple, added some richness to it as time followed. But the act of making sure that we are checking on a child-by-child basis is incredibly important to us. It goes back to that point that I made about making sure that nobody's left behind. It's through those that we were able to then stitch that back to the technology itself and making sure that we are really bringing rich experiences to life. It's less of a stick and more of a carrot. How are we encouraging and motivating students to be part of that virtual experience? And of course, there's an element of creativity in this, an element of fun, making sure that we are not just being driven by the academic. Our wider strategy considers academic, self and pathways as three equal strands in a child's education journey. So bringing in that self was really important to us. We introduced, as many did, the concept of Wellbeing Wednesdays, where we would just focus on fun and shamelessly so. So that was a really, really important part of our strategy. And as I say, something that we've taken with us and will be part of our strategy moving forward as well.
And James, thinking back to something you said earlier as well about your innovators and their role through this, I know that they played a really strong part and at a level of upskilling teachers to be able to deliver what you've been talking about. Do you want to talk a little bit more about them and their role?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for prompting that, actually. Innovators was as we talked about briefly earlier, was a concept that was in play pre-lockdown. And the concept really was to get together a set of champions that could represent AET in a technology sense across the trust. We had no concept really of just how critical they'd be as the year progressed. And it's really started with the need, if you like, the the initial foundations I've talked about were there, and it's great to be able to do stuff as a trust, but everybody needs to come on the journey together. So the Innovators had to get together in a rapid pace. From memory, I think we got together at the Google headquarters. A lot of the expertise that we drive is around Google and the technologies that sit around that. And then that resulted in a series of rollout sessions for the benefit of all of our staff. What we started to build up in the process was a bank of resources. The resources would later go on actually to be not just beneficial to AET, but form part of our offering for the EdTech Demonstrator Programme. And I'm glad that a further 80 schools on top of that have felt the benefit of the Innovators as a result. And sometimes it can be the basics. How do you create a Google Classroom? How do you make sure you're manipulating your resources? Sometimes it can be just best practice in the way that you're getting the best engagement within a lesson. How do you have a great quality video call? How do you make the use of your camera and not, etc. The Innovators, I think, are here to stay, though. Once again, they're now a really solid network, and we're actually just preparing towards what we're calling Innovators Reassemble, where we think about that next stage. They've got such a critical role now because we've got this opportunity post-pandemic to take this great experience that we've built up through lockdown and make it part of our future. And I have almost no doubt that if we didn't take some really important actions, it would be so tempting to kind of slip back towards the way things were. And far from me to be critical about the way things were, but the opportunity presents itself, and the Innovators are really key to that. So making that role not just something that's formal, but something to be really proud of is really important, and something that people can aspire to be part of. It is something that's we're really proud of that. We're really proud of that as a network.
They're, as an observer, James, they are a really strong network, and certainly a group of people who inspire and share best practice with their colleagues, which, and support, I think, as well. That's something that can't be overlooked, because actually some of these times have been pretty challenging, and to have a friendly face or a friendly ear or someone you can go to get that help when maybe you were working by yourself remotely.
Yeah, that's
and how do you keep that going?
It's a really good point, actually, and reminds me of something else, if you don't mind me just kind of going off.
Yeah.
Checking in. I talked about every child check-in. Of course, there's a massive element of staff check-in here as well, and I don't mean that as a check-up. I mean a check-in. And as a network of academies, it's really important that we come together, and that's such a big part of our response. Very quickly, we arrived at the concept of having check-ins a couple of times per week. And still to this day, we have head teacher check-ins every Thursday, where we get together every head teacher across the trust, the key members of our central team as well, and we share. And sometimes that will be about the central team sharing their examples of things that they've seen, or sharing some guidance that's been picked up, and it can be from things that are as simple as COVID testing in our response to that, to things that are more strategic in nature, like the masterclasses. But the best ones, to be honest, are when the head teachers are bringing their examples and sharing that with each other. And sometimes it can be challenging things rather than things, always the good news stories. Recent response to everyone's invited, and making sure we're doing the right things as a trust and learning from each other in the best way to support what is clearly an extremely serious and important matter. That's the kind of example that we're really kind of keen to carry on. I've probably gone a bit off tangent on the subject of COVID there, but hopefully it gives you a sense of how this network building is giving us benefit beyond COVID, actually.
And it's interesting, as you're touching on that, there have been quite a few reports about how do we maintain momentum of what's happened? How do you build that collaboration? How do you build those structures, particularly across multi-academy trusts when you've got groups of schools in different places? And it's interesting you mentioned very specifically about quite fixed tasks that happen to enable that. I wonder if you've got other things going on as well that enable you as a trust to drive forward your strategy, but also to get buy-in from your schools and your head teachers and staff.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's really important to us is the relationship that we have as a trust team with our schools. And for me, this is quite fascinating. So my day-to-day role is that I run the technology function, working in parallel to colleagues at RM in supporting the schools. There's an element of a dual role, if you like. On some occasions, I'm governing the schools and holding them to account on things. On other occasions, I'm their supplier and I'm supplying a service to them, and they're governing the level of service that I give to them. So it's quite fascinating, that relationship, and that's something that's in some extent is echoed right across the way in which AET runs. It is almost a network rather than an element of top-down governance. So kind of building on that, I suppose there's some key things to mention that are quite key to not just COVID response, but beyond that. We have a remarkable conference every year. The term remarkable is really something we play with and use quite heavily within AET. We talk about creating a remarkable life for each of our students. And the Remarkable Festival is something that we continue to do during lockdown. And actually, when I say continue to do, it was probably the biggest and best one we've ever had, because it was completely virtual. And getting the engagement on that with competitions, with input from across the trust, starts to bring out the input from the bottom up to the trust. And you as a trust team start to learn a lot about your schools. You get schools learning from each other. It just brings everybody together in such a powerful way. Now we talk about the journey to the festival. Right now we're in the process of working around the country, almost south to north, and building a story as we work around all of the academies on the way to the festival. And each week, an academy takes upon themselves to build out their element of the story, their page, if you like, in the journey. And it just builds this absolutely fantastic sense of community. It's still completely virtual, and actually, we're on the brink of making a decision. It looks likely that this year's festival will be virtual as well.
I was going to ask that, yeah.
And I think my personal view is it's all the better for it, because it just takes down barriers. It makes it more accessible. Everybody's on a level playing field. We just get great consistent input from everybody. There's a place for the physical, of course, and there are some things that technology just can't replicate. We're in the middle of designing a new pledge for AET, and there are some experiences that children, in our view, absolutely entitled to, that are physical. Visiting the seaside, seeing a major landmark in London, going and experiencing the wonders of musical instruments. Those things complement what we're talking about, and it would be wrong of me not to mention those things. It's not about moving to a full virtual world, but it's about making sure we're continuing to use our network and leveraging that moving forwards. I do have a habit of going off on tangents, Emma, and I hope you don't mind me doing
good tangents, James. It's all interesting, because actually, as you were talking about that, I was just thinking, actually, tougher question here. What is it that didn't work well for you during the pandemic? Were there things that you tried and you think, we've done that, we shouldn't, or we wouldn't do it again?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we're both, to an extent, technologists with an educationalist, real string to our bow. It sounds really obvious in hindsight, but technology for technology's sake, I suppose, is the main thing that jumps to mind, and that's something that I try and live by on a daily basis, really. And it's really easy to push forward with a mantra of, for example, we need to get everything in the cloud because that's the way we need to do things, and we had a lot of initiatives around that already in play pre-pandemic, and pushing that agenda for the technologists may seem like a really obvious thing to do, but unless you connect that to, well, what's the real reason for that, then that's certainly some learning is making sure that we're really connecting and bringing things to life in a real passionate way. I suppose the other thing is, and be delicate with my words here, balancing expectations of workload and staff morale. We surveyed intensely through the lockdown period, and continue to do so. And I mean surveying staff, I mean surveying parents, gauging input. and making sure that we're balancing that need to check in and understand, and giving reasonable expectations to our staff. Wouldn't necessarily call out that we did anything wrong there, but we were kind of feeling as we go and constantly trying to adjust and making sure that we are asking the right questions and getting the right responses. Being cognizant to people's, not just children's well-being that I talked about earlier, but staff well-being is really critical to that experience as well. I think that if we were to have another pandemic or be in another situation, we'd probably just be even braver and even bolder in moving forward with some of those early initiatives to try and help with workload, with well-being. Is that a suitably political answer for you, Emma? I feel like that's the question.
It's a good answer, James. I think without doubt, across schools, people have had to just try things. And I'm thinking, actually, if you're the teacher in the classroom as well, I don't know how much head teachers have fed back regarding, I've tried to use Hangouts, or I've tried to use Classroom, and this has or hasn't worked, and how I've managed my class in that environment. I'm sure you've had lots of examples from schools as well in terms of that, very practical. But I don't know what you would think. If you're trying and thinking and learning each time, it's a good cycle to go round.
It's a really good point. Yeah, it's another way to take your previous question, in that there's a big part of this which is about the failing fast mentality, isn't it?
Yeah.
And accepting that you won't get things right first time when you're trying different things. We maintain a register of the apps of the moment, I think we're calling it at the moment, which the technologies that are emerging that are working well for us. Could be different kind of whiteboard style software that will complement the way in which we're running Google Meets and allow for collaboration. And there'll be technology which we'll stumble across which seem great, and they'll really fit the need in concepts, but then they won't necessarily land. And it's just being kind of structured in the way that you do that, so you don't get carried away. So one of the things we've recently established is a little bit of a framework, a methodology, if you like, to be able to try new technologies in a safe environment, where we do what we call trigger technologies, understand them, test them, trial them, and then if we like it, then we'll train on them and track them. We call it the 5 T's. And so when you can remember what the 5 T's are, which I've just about got there, you've got a clear framework there where we're able to fail in a safe environment. We'll trigger, understand, but not everything will get all the way through the 5 T's. And that's our way, if you like, of providing an environment where we're hopefully feeling the pain on behalf of the whole trust. We also get the benefit as a result of getting the economies of scale there as well. So we are, failing once rather than failing 58 times. And hopefully, as a result, when we do succeed, you get 58 times the benefit. And hopefully you have good financial incentive there as well, because you might, if it involves any kind of investment, you'll get a good deal as a result as well. So it's definitely making sure you get the power of the network once again, rather than 58 different experiences all over again.
We seem to have lost a little bit of Emma.
I was wondering whether I just left her speechless, Simon. And
well, it has happened before. James, let's continue the conversation. Your job title is really quite interesting in an education setting. Chief Digital and Information Officer. There aren't many schools or trusts who can say that. What's your view, kind of post-pandemic, of teachers' attitude to technology, and how do you think that has changed in the last 14 months?
Well, I suppose you're right. It is an interesting job. The obvious kind of link in there is the existence of my role, which I'm obviously delighted to have. But I think it gives you a good insight into the attitude, certainly in our trusts, and I think on the bigger scale as well, as to how important technology is now to the future of education. And the investment that we've made is to put technology at the heart of our strategy moving forwards. So I talked earlier about academic, self, and pathways. They're the strands of our strategy. Technology is an underpinning layer to that.
And do you think that's been accepted by the education staff within your trust?
I do think that. Yeah, and of course you get various opinions, and different people have got different histories, different perspectives. I think most commonly, if there's any reservingness towards that view, it's based upon bad experiences in the past, and people that have been through different twists and turns with technology. But I see it as my job to help overcome that. But I think, you know, the silver lining to the experience we've been through is that people have, by hook or by crook, been forced to see the good in technology. And so that's why, generally speaking, I'm pushing an open door now with that kind of underlying piece of the strategy. The point that I would make, though, however, is let's not take it as a given that, you know, maybe we've got those people on board or people are feeling more positive now. Let's not take it as a given that it isn't reversible. So within our own technology strategy that supports that wider strategy, that foundational layer of never leaving a child or a student, a member of staff, a community member, an academy as a whole, never leaving anybody behind is so important. Because if you lose them, they will revert back. And that could easily be done, one bad experience. So you've got to have that foundation. And what I mean really is continued investment in the basics, the infrastructure, the devices, the CPD, the support. Don't take that away. Don't take it as a given that we're there or you know, and it's never going backwards. The further point to that is, let's continue with what we've started. Let's not take the urge to just go back to the way things are. For example, we have just, following the 18,500 devices we've put into the bank in the last year, we've just gone out and procured another 7,500, because we are going to be in a position where every secondary school student has their own personal device come the start of next academic year. And we know that isn't necessarily the way everybody's going. You know, in some cases, back to school devices, maybe they'll stay at home, maybe they'll come back into class, but they'll kind of go into trolleys and they'll be used at certain points. We want to take the opportunity to just push it and take that step further, because we feel like we're, as I say, kind of pushing at the open door, but it could close if we don't go now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And talk about open doors, Emma's back, so I shall drop out again.
Simon, thank you. And sorry, James, to leave you there for a minute. I think Simon started to move you on to looking ahead to how things might be a bit different going forwards as a result of what you've been doing over the last year or so. Just before we do that, if you were to sort of come up with sorry, James, this is really putting you on the spot, your top 5 of things that you learnt during your virtual learning experiences over the last year, and things to share with other people on this call, what would they be?
Wow. Top
Sorry.
5. Okay. I mean, I love the fact you made it 5, Emma, as well. You know, the obvious thing to 3, but you made it really
top
hard.
3. I was like, there's got to be loads. It'd be hard to pick.
Yeah, no, I've got a few in my head, so I'll just start and let's see. I may even go beyond 5. Here we go. So,
in whatever order.
Schools don't need to be bound by a physical building, and even by a set of physical hours, if hours are physical. That, you know, the opportunity now for extended days, or dare I say, you know, constant learning is there. Now, that doesn't mean making teachers work longer hours. That doesn't mean that you've got to push them and they've always got to be there in person. You can link between different locations. You can make learning different in its nature. It can be experiences, it can be reflection, but it just doesn't need to be bound in the same way. So that's number 1.
Yeah.
The importance of continuing that every child check-in that I mentioned is the number 2 that springs to mind. just for the audience benefit, Emma has really put me on the spot here. Actually, I'm not reading these off, just to be clear. I just want to make that really clear. So if they seem a little on the fly, but that's absolutely by design, isn't it? The importance of every child check-in, I think, continues. Aside from pandemic, well-being self is such a huge part of what we do now, and so why isn't that absolutely core to what we do? That's engagement with staff and parents. Once again, we should be continuing that in exactly the way that we've done it. I talked about having increased amount of surveys, checking in with staff and parents. So it's an extension of the every child check-in, but with staff and parents. Getting that engagement going more and more is really important post-pandemic as well as during.
Yeah.
Another one springs to mind: new roles for technology professionals, new roles for teachers. I don't think it's quite as simple now as you have teachers, you have support staff, you have IT engineers. I don't think the roles within schools will be quite so clear cut, or certainly there'll be new roles emerging. Technology support officers, or technology support leads, or teaching technology experts. There's hybrids there to be had. I really think that. And I suppose I think I've done 4 there, haven't I? So let me come with one.
I think you've done 5 actually, James.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure, there's probably.
Do you want to add one more? I might not be able to count.
No, let's stick with that. You're right. I've started left on a high. So there you go.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'd meant to ask you earlier actually about how you've seen engagement with parents change during the pandemic, because it's a thing that quite a few people have commented on that looks different than it did before.
Yeah. I mean, let's not beat about the bush. For the parents out there, of which I'm one, it's really been really challenging, and certainly in the first lockdown, the role of the parent, that's irrespective of AET's very proactive and quick response. There's a new role introduced there that parents weren't always prepared for, and in some ways understandably ill-equipped for. But to come out of that in a positive way, in the way that we have, through regular engagement, real sense of what the trust is doing, what academies are doing to support students, really clear expectations. And actually now we're at a place where we're thinking about our parental engagement in a different way to pre-lockdown. If you take the traditional check-ins in terms of parents' evenings and the way in which you engage with your parents as a body, that was one element of our pre-lockdown position. We also have parental engagements in the way that we have parental boards, PCABs within each of our academies, which gives parental input. That's quite a structured way of getting parental input. But actually now we see our role as a trust to be more of a community, parent and wider obligation. So we're just in the early stages of developing a parental virtual school, which will allow parents to engage with useful resources, technology as an example, but a whole wide range of things, as well as alongside that engage on the subject of their children and their experience of the academy. So we're seeing that engagement to be far more wide-reaching, particularly in the areas where there isn't that support in the community. And sometimes schools can be somewhat of a beacon in that community. We see that our obligation is wider, and we're really delighted that the lockdowns have given us that opportunity to engage with our parents in a way that we weren't necessarily doing before.
Yeah, that's really helpful, James. And sorry for putting you on the spot with those 5 points. I feel a little bit bad now. You said challenge me.
I asked for it. I just felt the need to call it out, just for the benefit of the audience.
That was really, really helpful. It's always interesting to see what does come to the forefront of your mind, actually, isn't it, at those points? But you started to touch on with Simon what things look like for you going forwards, you know, taking some of those things that you've learned, things that haven't worked so well, and you spoke about not losing momentum. So from an IT strategy for you going forwards, and potentially touching a bit into, you know, the overlap into curriculum and how that will work, do you want to just say a little bit about what that's looking like as you move forwards?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you're onto the core of my day-to-day, you know.
Yeah.
So you'll have to stop me when I get carried away. But I've talked earlier, as Simon briefly chatted with us, about the opportunity that we're presented with now, and really what we've been doing as we move out of lockdown is just taking that step back, having a look at where we are, and look at how we move forwards. And I suppose that it's worth just taking a step back to what I described in terms of our scale as a trust and what seems reasonable as a set of aspirations as a result of that. And you look at our scale, as I mentioned earlier, 30,000 students, 5,000 staff. Take any organisation that's got 5,000 staff. It doesn't need to be an educational nature organisation, just any organisation. They should be having really high standards in their expectation in the way they use technology. And then apply that back into the education setting and say, well, what does that look like then? What does world-class technology and support really look like? It definitely starts with that foundational layer that I mentioned to Simon. You cannot underestimate the importance of having those foundations right and continuing to invest in those foundations, future-proof those foundations. Think about your device strategy, think about your connectivity, think about how every single user you have will feel about those foundations, because if they're not right for them, you're on uneven ground. Excuse the analogy, but that is a fact. But if you get them right, you can build upon them with some really exciting building blocks. So the 4 building blocks we have, the first one that kind of goes immediately on top of that is about staying safe and thriving with that technology. So absolutely staying safe is the first part of that. It's well publicized that, perhaps not coincidentally as a result of the pandemic, but perhaps coincidentally, let's just say it for what it is, there's heightened risk in technology and education at the moment. There's an all-time high level of cybersecurity threat. So staying safe and helping our people to feel really safe in the way they use technology is important. And that, you know, that's safeguarding, that's cybersecurity protection, with education of how to be vigilant, as well as the technology underlying that. But the step beyond that is thriving. How do you feel really confident in the way you're using it? How do you feel happy in the way you're using technology? How do you feel like you're bettering yourself, becoming life ready, work ready in the way you're using technology? That's the first building block. The next building block is about quality of engagement. We've experienced so much across lockdown around engagement and collaboration, but there's more to be done. We've done great engagement, we've done great collaboration, but how do we measure that, and how do we make it even better moving forwards? How do we use technology to understand those engagements that have been really powerful, that have really made a difference, and those that have been less impactful, and why were they? How can we assess that using technology? And then as a result, how can we then create better engagements? I talked about the parent virtual school earlier. I think that's a good example of where we are trying to create new types of engagement, which we perhaps wouldn't have been doing pre-pandemic. If I move to another building block, being leaders in teaching and learning technologies. And this is where I've come back to that academic, the self, and the pathways, and being really structured in the way that we go through those 5 T's that I mentioned. So we aren't necessarily just, if you like, kind of asking our academies to just stumble across technologies and find what's right for them. We're being structured about the way we do that. And there's a role of industry there. Can I say, for anybody that is from industry that's listening, and including colleagues at RM, we want to work with industry to get the best from them, so that we get those emerging technologies. We have really clear evidence-based technology that can marry up to great teaching and learning. There's also an element of exploring new as well, and cutting edge areas that traditionally education can be slow to adopt. Everybody tends to think of education as an environment that is slow to adopt new technologies. why is my challenge there. Why is that the case? Why isn't it one of the first? Because everybody agrees education is really important. Well, why is it only now that we're trialing voice assistants or, kind of artificially intelligent, voice-driven in schools? We're just running a pilot now. That's great, but why is it now when most of us have a Google Home or an Alexa or whatever device of your choice in your home already? Why are consumers ahead? Education should be on the cutting edge, trying new things. Certainly, in our case, where we can create a safe environment to do so. And then, last but not least, the last building block is around the way in which we use data and enabling data to, using data to enable constantly brave data-led decisions. I talked about being brave at the start, and we were able to make that brave decision around device investment at the start. But was that based upon absolute kind of concrete data and evidence? Perhaps, maybe not. I won't comment too much. But moving forwards, we need to be really, really clear what data is doing for us. And it's less about being really, really kind of influx with data and have it from every different angle, and more about generating really great quality insights. So I consider that a technology challenge. I consider that something that technologists should be doing on the behalf of their, if you like, their customers, their trusted, bringing that data to the fore and presenting it as insights. Well, the 2 or 3 things as a head teacher or as a trust member you need to really know, so that you can then base your discussion and your thought on what you should be doing rather than what does the data mean. And so I think that actually our opportunity to do this now is just infinitely more possible than where we were 12 months ago. And I feel, as you can probably tell, feel really buoyant about the opportunities that present themselves. And I just hope that others agree with me and kind of share that view. I equally welcome challenge on that, because there'll be other things I haven't quite got there yet, but we're just delighted to be kind of moving in that direction.
James, thank you. That's really interesting to hear about the next steps, where this has taken you and what you've learned during that lockdown period. I am conscious we've got towards 2:45. So Simon, I am going to hand over to you. But James, once again, thank you. I really enjoyed catching up with you.
Thank you, Emma.
And thank you, Emma, and thank you, James, especially. That was definitely, I was sort of joking at the start about this is, one of the best sessions saved to last, and it certainly has been. So, James, but I'm not going to let you off the hook, because we've had quite a few questions have come in. So if I could try and get through 3 or 4 questions, so short answers if we can, James. The first question comes from David. And he's asking you about, you talked right at the beginning about AET being a values-driven organization. And I think, as you know, at RM, we have a very similar approach. We have a very strong purpose. We have very clear values. But David's question is really about how important do you feel that was for how you responded to the pandemic when the seriousness of it first became apparent? The fact that you had those values, how useful was that in terms of your response?
Great question. I think the risk with values is they can sometimes be less tangible, can't they? And they can sometimes be difficult to link to tangible actions. And hopefully, I gave you one example of where it became tangible. That being unusually brave. I mean, just briefly touching on the other 3 that we have. Push the limits and always striving to push to overcome barriers and challenges that are put in front of us, discovering what's possible, looking for those eureka style moments, and being big-hearted, really being kind and warm to the people that we work with and are around. And it probably doesn't take too much to see how important all of those were. And hopefully it's been clear in my description about making sure that we're overcoming the barriers. So schools are shut. That doesn't mean that learning stops. That doesn't mean that our schools don't continue to operate. We still absolutely consider schools open throughout the pandemic. Discovering what's possible, pushing the envelope on terms of how we could use it to the technology to the fullest, and being big-hearted. Well, that's just about making sure that we're just being really empathetic to what everybody was going through. So I would say, to answer David's question, not just important, critical, and bound us all together in the way that we do.
Yeah, and certainly, James, I think I've spoken to a number of schools over the last 10 months or so, and I'm hearing the same sort of story. Those schools that found it easier to respond, or those who were better prepared, were a united front, were able to be resilient and to cope with what was thrown at them. And I think it's no surprise that you've described that from AET's perspective, so thank you. The second question, I think, builds on the point that I made when I interrupted earlier, really, was what do you think, what in your memory, what was the biggest pushback that you faced from staff and also from students when you moved to remote learning, you moved to a much greater technology delivery of the curriculum? What was the pushback you had to overcome?
I think the single biggest thing was confidence. I often think about, if you like, users, horrible term I know, but our people on a spectrum of confidence and ability. And I regularly find that confidence level is what holds people back with embracing different ways of working, the technology, the ability, particularly, I'm not here as a Google salesperson, but the usability and the ability for people to get to their grips with using technologies like Google Classroom, they can get there really quickly, but the confidence to be able to get there and get started is what was the biggest barrier by far. Encouraging a PE teacher to get their head around how they could play their part in getting the use of Google Classroom and getting their own kind of mini version of Joe Wicks going for their students. That's a really big barrier because they're used to running out onto the field and operating the way they do. So that's probably the biggest thing is getting people's confidence. And just for the avoidance of doubt, the way in which you get that up is support. That's where the Innovators group came in. That's where taking them on that journey.
Yeah, fabulous. So Daniel, thank you for that question. Two quickies, if I can finish. What are you most excited about next in terms of EdTech that will enhance the experience for learners, but also for teachers?
So I'm going to avoid the kind of temptation to throw in. Everybody tends to kind of gravitate towards artificial intelligence, don't they, as a thing. That's more of an underlying technology. But the application of some of the things that are coming out as a result of that, I think, are really important. And I'm not here to necessarily sell a product or kind of push down a particular line. But I think if you look at some of the applications that are coming into the fore as a result of that, and also to the fore as a result of a kind of exposure to different ways of working. If you look at the assessment space, the way in which assessment can be done in a different way as a result, looking at peer-to-peer reviewing, looking at the way that you can use, comparative judgment, it's just fascinating. And there's new interest in that because of what we've been through in the last 12 months. The technology is there, yes, but because we've been forced to think about models that have been set in place for tens, if not hundreds of years in the way that they work. And I'm really excited that people are open to that possibility.
Definitely. And I think, what we've been through has allowed us to have that conversation that perhaps in pre-pandemic people would have just parked or put in the bottom drawer. If I could just build on that with another question, really, if we go back to 14, 15 months, the top question that was coming out of the research that I was doing within RM was that teacher workloads was the top agenda item pre-pandemic. Everybody was talking about it. It clearly slipped down the list for very obvious reasons. But how often do you discuss that within the trust, and what role do you see technology playing in addressing those teacher workload challenges?
Yeah, it comes up regularly. I talked about the staff surveys that we do still on a weekly basis, and still with 5,000 staff, it is inevitable that still people are concerned about their workload. We haven't solved that, and it's very easy to put 2 and 2 together and get 5 when I talk about things like extending the school day and pushing the boundaries on teaching and learning, that people just assume, well, that's going to put workload up, isn't it? But actually, go back to some of the things I talked about: masterclasses, different types of experiences, bringing in industry and different ways of teaching and learning. Actually, let's focus the teacher workload on the bit that they can do with their students on a one-to-one or a one-to-many basis. So, and also link that to my point about different roles as well. Not making it so clear cut as teaching staff, support staff, having the right people to do the right role and keeping workloads reasonable within that. It is not, I'm not giving you all the answers there, I know, but it continues to come up. And it's actually just about being sensible about the way in which you can apply solutions to some of the things I've talked about already, as opposed to just putting it all onto the teacher.
Definitely. And again, I go back to the point I made earlier. I think for the trust to be so ambitious to have a chief digital officer, I think allows those sort of things to come to the fore and to be debated in a way that perhaps a small primary or even a small secondary may not have the opportunity to discuss them. So I think, that's an example of the trust being brave. So well done there. Very last question comes from Lisa. She says that she loves the idea of the parental virtual school, interested in how that concept came about, what are your aspirations for it, and how does that complement and support your parental engagement communication plans?
Yeah, it came about really from our experiences in those early part of lockdowns, and our parents were put in a position where they had to support their children with some of the basics around the virtual learning, and as sad as it is to say, it's evident that in some parts of our community that there wasn't that exposure to technology to feel confident about either the technology itself, or indeed when you got into the teaching and learning elements of the things that children were being taught. And so the parent virtual school will encapsulate all of that and offer a base level of learning to parents that would benefit from it. So our aspirations are to offer something to our communities which are really kind of all-encompassing and far-reaching to give everybody that feeling of support. Where it might go, we're definitely open to being completely flexible about it and seeing the things that are get home the most, if you like, and the things that really start to make a difference. How does it fit with parental engagement more generally? Well, we think that if we can create that connection through the parent virtual school, it's only going to be a good thing when it gets to engagement on the children's education journey and how they feel about the role of the school and the trust as a whole. So we're seeing this as another string to the bow in the overall parental engagement strategy.
Absolutely. We've kind of run out of time because I know there was another couple of questions. I know Mark had a question about Wi-Fi. I don't know if in sort of 60 seconds you can talk about how you responded to the Wi-Fi challenges of remote learning and what that means for the future. Quickly.
Yeah, Wi-Fi dongles were absolute saver for us, and investing to get the right data allowance, etc. So making sure that there were no boundaries there. And then in school, we've been on a whole program of fit for future connectivity improvement. Continue to be on that journey, but it's really important.
Yeah, and I think it's often overlooked and is generally, the core infrastructure of any sort of cloud-based future blended learning type environment. You have to have great Wi-Fi, and again, it's good to call that out. So thank you, Mark, for that question. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of this session, I'm afraid. James, you have been an absolute joy to listen to participate with. I think your story is amazing, and again, hats off to the Trust for hiring you in the first place, giving you the title you've got, and allowing you to do some of the things that I know you strongly believe in, and clearly will be the benefit of the pupils of AET and the parents of those pupils. So well done for that. For those who joined the call, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something from it. I hope you got some ideas and some things that you can take back into your own schools and trusts, because there is lots of things we can do from here. We really are at the start of this technology journey within education. So within the next 48 hours, but probably sooner, we will share with everybody who's on the call an attendee pack that contains a recording of the session. For those who are looking for the CPD element, there'll be a certificate of attendance, but there's also going to be a short survey. I think I mentioned earlier, I'm the marketing director for RM, and I thrive on surveys, on research. And please, if you could spend just a few seconds to complete that survey, it really will help us improve this summit next time we run it, improve these sessions. Invite James back again, perhaps, if you think he's done a great job, as I know you will think that. But please do fill in the survey; it's really important. And also, please stick around for the next session. It starts at 2 o'clock, which is about now, so I better shut up. Which is all about should we still use technology after COVID? So clearly very relevant. It's from Pedro de Breca, who's an education scientist and myth buster. And of course, you'll find full access to all of the content from the summit on demand for the next 3 months. So please do keep popping back. There have been some wonderful presentations, not just James's. So please join them. And once again, on behalf of RM and TTS Consortium, thank you for attending, and I wish you well with the rest of the session. Thank you.